Good afternoon. Let me introduce myself. My name is Emily Hough and I'm Editor-in-Chief of the Crisis Response Journal. We're working with the Emergency Show and International Disaster Management Exhibition, both of which are part of the World Humanitarian Forum's portfolio of events. And we're working together on this series of webinars and other ventures, which aim to encourage a cross-sector and multidisciplinary dialogue, as well as to share knowledge and experience. Today's subject is one very close to my heart. We're going to be looking at crisis and emergency planning from the perspective of SMEs, entrepreneurs and micro-businesses. And as I'm sure will emerge during the discussions, the way that such businesses are affected by, plan for and handle shocks is very different to the large corporate world. It's no understatement to say that SMEs are the backbone of societies globally. The World Bank acknowledges their importance, highlighting how they play a vital role in most economies, even more so particularly in the developing world. It says they represent about 90% of businesses and more than 50% of employment worldwide. I've also read that there's an estimated 582 million entrepreneurs in the world. In the UK alone at the start of 2020, and things might have changed given the year that we've just had, the Federation of Small Businesses says that SMEs accounted for 99.9% of the business population, provided 3/5 of employment and around half of the turnover in the UK private sector. In 2019, the UK government says that there were 5.82 million small businesses of 0 to 49 employees. This all shows that SMEs are, simply put, crucial to society. Yet, if you're taking part in this webinar and run a small business or work with small businesses, you probably don't feel very appreciated or crucial right now and are probably very, very tired at the moment. You're not alone with that. With that in mind, this webinar intends to look at the weaknesses, opportunities, and mindsets that can make the difference between survival and failure. We want to demystify the business continuity and resilience processes, and we're going to be speaking from hard-learnt experience. All of our panels, as well as being members of the Crisis Response Journal Advisory Panel, have not only worked in large organisations, but also run their own businesses, as do I myself. So there's a lot of experience today at the sharp end. Adding further to this expertise, today, all three panellists advise and consult on crisis preparedness and emergency management. Now, the format's simple. Each panelist is going to take a few moments to outline their key thoughts, then we move into the discussions. And I'd encourage participants to ask their own questions, or some of you have already submitted some. We'll try our best to answer them. So let me introduce the panelists. I'm going to have to truncate their extensive experience, so I'm very sorry about that, everyone, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time for the discussions. Lyndon is Chief Knowledge Officer for the Disaster Recovery Institute. In this role, he leads the Future Vision Committee, which provides thought leadership. He produces the Institute's annual reports on resilience trends and predictions. Lyndon's worked exclusively in business continuity since 1986 as a consultant, educator, author, business owner, and more recently, professional institute executive. He and two partners founded the first pan-European business continuity consultancy in the Netherlands. He brought this company and concept to the UK and helped convince the embryonic disaster recovery industry of the need for a wider business-driven approach. He was one of a few senior practitioners who helped to found the Business Continuity Institute, the BCI, in 1994 and served as Institute Chairman for 3 years. Since 2015, Robert McAlister has run his own consultancy, Glenbarr, which provides specialist advice and training across varied portfolios. After leaving the British Army, Robert moved into the private sector, working in senior security and risk management posts. Robert joined Westminster Local Authority Community Protection Department in its infancy to work on crime and disorder projects. His post expanded in 2009 to include head of civil contingencies, and Rob was the lead officer for developing and managing the local authorities' control, coordination and communication planning ahead of the UK 2012 Olympic Games. In 2015-2016, he worked in Sierra Leone under Operation Gritrock to deliver strategic crisis and disaster management training to help develop capacity building and transition planning during the Ebola and flooding crises. In addition, Robert created the RVTS East Crisis Leadership Academy in Norway, which is designed to help develop designed to develop crisis leaders of the future. And last but not least, we have Mike O'Neill. Mike joined the British Army and saw active service in the Falklands and Northern Ireland before leaving as a major in 1990. After a period consulting for a number of risk and security management companies, he started his own company, which he merged in 2010 with Perpetuity Consulting to create Optimal Risk Group. He's worked in various parts of the world on risk and threat assessments, crisis planning and response, contingency planning, security planning, and testing assignments. Mike's absolutely passionate about helping clients understand the risks they face and helping them to prepare a resilient strategy to assist them to survive and thrive. So moving quickly on, we'll start with the introductory statements and we'll stay with the alphabetical order for the moment. So if we could start with you, Lyndon, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Thank you for those who are attending and listening and watching us around the world. So I was going to say good afternoon, but it could be good morning or good evening to some of you. My name's Lyndon Bird, as Emily said, and I'm Chief Knowledge Officer for the Disaster Recovery Institute International, which is primarily based in New York, but is a global organization. I've been in this sort of business now for 35 years, getting on for 35 years, starting from disaster recovery in the old days through the mainstream days of business continuity, and more recently we've moved into what we're now calling either organizational or enterprise resilience management. I think I've seen most of it and also found out what works, and to some extent more about what doesn't work in the route map I've taken. Over the years I've had many struggles with SMEs. For our American friends, that's small and medium-sized businesses rather than the SME term, I think. Why is that? Not that I had struggles with them personally, but trying to get them to buy into any concept of formal business continuity management. They've always told me it's too bureaucratic, it's too procedural, it's too prescriptive, it's too inflexible. It's too much about compliance and not about real operational performance. I've had to listen because I've heard it so often. So I came to the conclusion I must be wrong and they must be right. And perhaps I was asking the wrong question. Perhaps instead of asking them, why aren't you doing business continuity the way larger firms do? Maybe I should have been asking the question is, what are you doing to mitigate your risks? That means that you don't actually need to do business continuity in the same way. And that's turning the question around. And when I turned that question around and started talking to SMEs about how they actually did the things that we were trying to accomplish, but accomplish them in different ways, then I began to realize why we had got this problem of struggling to bridge that gap. So what fundamentally to me was the difference seemed to be quite simple. It was simply about whether they had much in the way of what I was calling automatic resilience or duplication. And the bigger your organization is, the more money you've got, the more staff you have, the more premises that you have, probably the more products you produce or sell, the more clients you have. So loss of any one of those, even a major aspect of them, can probably be compensated or with good logistics can be handled. So there's a lot of inbuilt duplication, less what I'd call single points of failure in there. Small businesses, just the reverse. The smaller the worse, but all SMEs to some extent don't have those benefits. But what they do have as benefits is flexibility, innovation, speed of response. I've known to do a working session with an SME group, and we've effectively, in one afternoon's workshop, probably re-engineered the whole of their business if they had to. Try doing that with a major corporate and you'll be there for a year and still not get anywhere. So to me, there's one thing that I shall be stressing that in the rest of the afternoon's presentation when on my questions is it's all about understanding your business. If you understand your business, you know what's important, you know what's going to be left, you know, or instinctively what you have to do. Large corporates, so it sounds very strange to say, so often don't know that. Individual parts of a corporate know what they have to do in their department, their division, but they don't understand how it all fits together. SMEs do. They know what it fits together. They know what they have to do. They know what they can't afford to lose. So the whole complicated bit of business continuity is largely taken out of the equation for SMEs. So this idea of understanding your business to drive everything else that you do, I think is key to the difference. And I think I'll be able to talk more about that later. So thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Lyndon. I think that's a really good point. It's instinctive, and it is about understanding your business. So a lot of SMEs are already practicing this, just not within the terminology or the context that larger organisations apply this, because it is about survival, isn't it? Rob, can we have
certainly. I'll keep it brief. Thank you very much for the introduction, Emily, and welcome to everyone joining us today from lots of different places, interestingly. So you're all on different time zones. So some of you might be slightly dozy, sleepy. So we'll hopefully keep this exciting for you. Just to say that I'm actually a director of an SME. So my business is relatively small. I'm based in the UK, I'm based in London, but I work internationally. And actually, instead of doing what I would be doing today, I'd normally be away somewhere actually with one of you in the countries that you're probably phoning in from. So I've been impacted, as have most of my colleagues, as have yourselves. And I'm hoping what I'm going to bring today is a little bit of a reality check on what I've found, what I've experienced over the last 10 months, but also how possibly we can move forward, learn some of the lessons. As I said, I work internationally, so hopefully I've got a fairly good appreciation of what's going on in places that you're operating from, but also some of the challenges, and hopefully trying to keep this not too UK centric, but a little bit wider than that. So apart from that, I'll probably hand over to the next lucky participant and look forward to speaking to you further.
Thanks a lot, Rob. I mean, it's very true. We are all experiencing the same things, aren't we? And we are all in smaller businesses. Mike, international man of mystery, you've gone very dark on our screens again, I'm afraid, but let's hope we can hear you. Would you like to make your introductory statement, please?
Well, first of all, I'd like to apologise everybody out there for a lack of resilience planning on the lighting front here. Yes, I'd like to echo a few of the points brought up by Lyndon and Rob. I think one of the points that we have to understand and appreciate is how resilient small business is. Inherently, it's pretty flexible, responds quite well, understands its business as has been brought out. There are bigger challenges out there over the last 9-10 months or so. But I also think there's a lot that can be done to dispel the myths around the big words, the big phrases: business continuity management, incident management, emergency response, emergency management, resilience planning. All of those are enough to make a lot of us go off and stick our heads in the sand. And I think that's the response that we see from a lot of small business managers. But you have to, sorry, I'll go back and change that. Small business owners and managers. And I think that's also one of the things. Many people that operate SMEs are not only emotionally involved, they're financially involved. They may have put their savings into it. They may have secured loans against their houses. So this is really a life impacting decisions for them. And I think one of the things we've tried over the years is to take away that mystique, particularly with SMEs. And I'll talk a little bit later perhaps about some of the ways that we do that. But I'm very passionate about helping organizations become resilient. I'm also passionate that we do away with a lot of the buzzwords where they actually hinder people moving towards that state. So Emily, back to you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that's very true about the buzzwords, and sometimes they can be quite excluding, whereas actually some of these words are describing what are already being done as just part of good business management and processes. It's thinking what happens if that happens and so forth. And thanks also for picking up on the emotional and financial involvement is sort of a positive and a negative, isn't it? It makes it personal. You've got skin in the game, but that makes the incentive to make this succeed even stronger. So we're going to drill down a little bit into some of the points that you've all made. And the first question, which is sort of in two parts, I'll ask the first part first, and then I'll come round to you again, is how do you really see business continuity management, emergency management, and resilience as applied to small businesses? Are there any pitfalls that they need to avoid? And I'm going to come to you again, Lyndon, for that one first, please.
Okay, well, that's yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question. I would say the objectives are the same. It doesn't matter really what sort of business you are, because the objectives of what we're trying to do isn't that complicated. I mean, I have a friend in the business who says, well, we make it too complicated and it should be called basic common sense management, BCM. And there is some point to that sort of rather flippant comment. But essentially what we are looking to do is finding ways of mitigating the impact of things if they go wrong. We don't really need to get too complicated into theories of risk management, although obviously it's all part of it. But it's really about how do we mitigate impact? And we mitigate impact because we need to know how we would respond to situations. So the formal process that you go through in any sort of business continuity life cycle, whether it be something that's produced from the BCI or my organization, the DRI, or international standards, tends to imply a certain formality to exactly how you do things, which takes time. And as I said in my introduction, it's very procedural. So that can largely be streamlined for an SME. You can often do a BIA in an afternoon with an SME, get some get the owner, stroke CEO, whoever the structure is, and his key management team together, or her key management team together, and bounce some ideas around. And by the end of the afternoon, you will know all the key priorities. You'll know all the things that have to be recovered. You'll know all the things that can be held back a bit. You'll know all the difficulties and conflicts that you're going to have. Similarly with a risk assessment, often you don't really need to do a risk assessment at all. You go to a small business's premises and you can see from the premises and the way they operate that they are at risk and that things can very quickly go wrong. So from a formal point of view, you may want to do it for your auditors or for your insurers to document all of this stuff. But in practical terms, to protect yourself, you don't need to spend a lot of time. So to me, that is the pitfall. The biggest problem for small companies is they get thrown too much jargon by so-called experts, probably like myself on occasions, unfortunately, which they don't really need to have. What they need to know is to find out, as exactly as you said, Emily, in your introduction, is if things go wrong, what are we going to do about it? And essentially, that's the essence of it. And if we can stick to the essence, then we can involve them and get SMEs to do business continuity, but in a streamlined way.
Thank you very much. Mike, we can see you a little bit better now, so I'd like to come to you next.
Amazing what you can find when you fiddle around in the settings. I think my points about that, again, echoing the points Lyndon's made, but if you're worried about getting turned off by fancy titles, just sit down, a blank sheet of A4 paper or whatever is the standard size in your part of the world, and write down about the things that concern you. If this happened, how worried would I be? And then start to put down, if that happened, what would I do? What should I do? Identify those single points of failure. Where are the critical areas of your business? What are the critical assets? If you lose access to your office or your plant for a morning, is that critical? Can you live with that? Most people could. A week, a month, it could be something that just restricts access because it's happened to somebody else. So think about these things and then think about here's the what ifs, and then you have the so whats. What's the impact of that? How do I deal with that? And run that through with your team. I know Lyndon talked about the head shed, as I would think about it in military terms, but the senior team. But actually look around within the organization and start to talk to other people and say, look, we've been talking about this. Have you got any input? It's amazing how the workarounds that may even be going on within your organization when something goes wrong that you never happen to hear about, because the workarounds are so ingrained. It's just that people don't even think of them as that. So it's about really understanding what goes on in the organization. How do people adapt and overcome without even raising it up as a management issue? So I think that's something that I would definitely encourage. I think you also need to engage with your clients in terms of understanding what's important to them. So if you're able to phone them and say, look, we can't get that shipment out today because the police have blocked the road off because of an incident, nothing to do with us. Then if they go, oh, well, I know we've got a date, but we're always fairly flexible. We have a certain amount of stock that we carry. It gives you a better understanding about the critical aspects. You may overreact to something because you're trying to achieve something that you don't actually have to, but also look at your own supply chain. Are there single points of failure in your supply chain? That may be another SME that produces a particular widget or provides a service that you need. If they actually have to, they have a problem, how are you going to get around that? It might make you look at carrying a bit more of a buffer stock, looking for a different supplier. And if it is a different supplier, make sure you at least give them some of the business so they're motivated and they can step up when it comes to it. So you need to be able to look above you and below you and understand where your vulnerable points are. Okay.
That's again, that's a very good point, especially with regard to the external factors and you know, your suppliers, but also neighbours that that you might be located near and it happening to someone else and affecting you. Rob.
Yeah, I'm going to put a little bit of the cat amongst the pigeons, unsurprisingly. I actually think the pitfall has already happened because I think that a lot of businesses were completely unprepared for this, whether it was large, medium or small. And I think we've learned a lot of valuable lessons throughout this. In fact, I would say that most SME CEOs, directors, staff are now crisis management, experts themselves because they've been living and breathing this for about 10, 12 months. So I think the pitfall was we were woefully unprepared. I think echoing both Lyndon and Mike, the jargon, having a certificate, having a standard is all well and good on paper, but how did that translate into operational practices and resilience and being prepared? And I think what we've seen is a bit of a wake-up call, really, a bit of a reality check on this is all fantastic and it sounds wonderful and we're all in the same business, we're all selling this stuff, but how did it translate into actual preparedness? And I think it pretty much failed in a lot of respects. So I think we need a bit of a shake-up of all of this to get a kind of sense of it's not just about ticking a box. It's actually about having this stuff in place that's robust enough to be able to translate when we need it. And I think that's probably going to be something that needs to be discussed a lot more as we go forward.
Just a quick question to that, Rob, because in some ways, I know I'm always banging the drum for really, really tiny businesses for some strange reason, but because obviously being one ourselves, do you not find that maybe the failures are in the sort of medium to large businesses, because that's sort of the one person businesses, they have just, I think personally, that they have, so many have responded incredibly and really thought creatively and flexibly. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. I
don't disagree. But from what's out there and what you see and what you read, and some of the data that's out there about small businesses, even the one-man bands, I think because there's probably a lack of scrutiny to some degree. They say they've got these plans in place. Have they been tested? Have they been exercised? And I'm not talking about a big embedding of BCI in this. I'm talking about, have you actually, going back to Mike's point, have you thought about the what ifs, and what have you done about the what ifs? And what have you done about those impacts? It's great, ticking the box and going through the exercise, but how did it actually translate into real world business? So to some degree, yes, I think probably medium to large have been impacted, but they've got possibly more systems and procedures and processes in place to cover it, Emily. The one-man band, if that person, going back to Mike's point, if you're the single point of failure, and you go down, your business is gone. So it could be as basic as your own health, your own well-being, and we're all pretty bad at that, to be honest with you.
That's something we're going to come to later on in the webinar as well. I suppose this all does tie in with a question we had from the audience, and that was, and that sort of leads on to the single point of failure, the external factors, and all these things. The question is, how can we formalise SMEs with the business continuity and resilience more? Research has shown that when those in close proximity band together with planning for floods, for example, they fare much better than when acting alone. How can we ensure this happens more often and for other risks? And I'd like to ask you, Mike, if that's all right. We lost you, Mike. How about Lyndon then?
No, there we are. I'm back.
Oh,
now we've got Mike back.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a great supporter of that. It's that community resilience approach, which we have actually seen a lot of, particularly around natural disasters and other things like that. But I think as well, we can take an interesting situation that I'm aware of, London hotels. If one of the London hotels has to evacuate its residents in the middle of the night, they have some fairly formal, informal arrangements with nearby hotels that will take the residents there at least into their lounges and their bars and dining rooms to be able to shelter them, give them some basic refreshments. And they do that because they know they all work in the same sector. They don't try and take any competitive advantage from it. There's no payment. It's just one of those things that they're in a competitive sector, but they all are in that same sector and want to portray it well. So I think it's there is a natural community response. I know that there are people trying to develop different apps to try and build community resilience and improve it. And we'll talk a bit more about that type of thing later, I know. But I think it's a great way to do it. And it's we talk to clients all the time. If you have to evacuate, whether it's a normal corporate premises or, but also move away from your car park, talk to the businesses next door. People are surprisingly accommodating at times like that. And I know from my experience that there's a whole little network out there in various areas of security managers who talk to what the CEOs would regard as their competitors in a very practical way to make sure that they all improve their own security and their resilience at times like that. So that's definitely to be encouraged.
Thank you very much. Lyndon?
Yeah, I mean, I share a lot of that. One of the things I say is that you can't do it on your own. A small business doesn't have sufficient control of all the external factors that it needs in order to be able to survive any crisis or any impact. So you've got to do it with other people. It's simply a question of what other people are going to do it with. And to me, there's a whole range of people. I mean, if you may think you can do certain things, but when you speak to the police, when you speak to the fire service, when you speak to environmental protection people in the area, you might find that, well, yeah, that we thought we could move there, or we thought we could take people there, or we thought we could shut this off and do that. And you find that actually, in a reality, you would not be able to do that. So first of all, trying to build any sort of plan for an immediate response without working with other agencies, other people. How are you going to, in a small business, work without your neighbours? If you're in a multi-tenanted building, how are you going to work without discussing with your landlords, discussing with all the other people in the building, discussing with the people who provide central services? So you can't do these plans on your own. They're actually impossible. So sitting down, any organisation that sits down and says it's done it on its own, probably is not got something that can work. It can work on paper. The important thing as well, I thought, which was great from the last point, it was I was going to make in a slightly different ways. Don't forget your competitors, because competitors, you always think, oh, we couldn't deal with competitors at all. But in emergency situations, competitors are not necessarily going to wish to take advantage. And sometimes they work together quite well on things. I remember many years ago now, but back in the days when we had the Y2K, as we called it then, I worked a lot in retail in those days, and all the major retailers worked in cooperation with the other because they essentially all had the same problem, and they were going to the suppliers that supplied everyone. Well, what was the point of them all going asking the same questions to the same supplier? They coordinated, so one major retailer dealt with a certain group, another major worked with another group, and they provided the input back to the central group who had joint arrangements. Because if it had have gone wrong, it didn't, of course, but if it had gone wrong, everybody would have the same effect. So often you can find your competitors can work together with you on things that have and no real competitive advantage one way or another. So don't forget your competitors. Don't forget some subcontractors. Sometimes you subcontract work. Maybe they can do more for you. So talk to everyone. In fact, I believe the more people you talk to, the better. Talk to your employers. As I said before, make sure you get feedback from everywhere. So the answer is yes. You can't do it. You can't do it on your own. And the more people that are on board with what you're trying to do, the better.
Thanks ever so much. Rob?
Yeah, kind of agree with all of those points. I mean, I think most people will agree that the true first responders are actually the affected people themselves. Okay, the emergency services will eventually turn up, but a lot of small businesses will be left alone for, a brief period where they'll be doing things for themselves. So I suppose it's how can we, or what can we give those people to be a little bit more self-sufficient, minimum standards requirements, how they plug in to the emergency services, which is pretty much what Lyndon was talking about. That these people will be doing things around you, but how do you maximize that? And I also think sometimes we start to look after the worst affected when actually possibly looking after the least affected and then mobilizing them to help themselves can be quite a good strategy. So I think, again, it's not enough for this debate. We haven't got enough time, but it's what can we do to build that community ability to bounce quickly back into action.
I think some of that has to come from the community itself rather than being imposed as well, doesn't it? I mean, I want to turn now to something more positive because, and you've all touched upon this earlier, and small businesses do have strengths that the larger organizations and corporates don't have. Can we take a few minutes to look at these strengths and see how we can get SMEs to understand their strengths, their creativity and their opportunities, especially in times of crisis? And I think, Mike, perhaps you could start on this one, please.
Thanks, Emily. Well, I think the first thing with SMEs is there are fewer silos. There's tends to be better communication across the organization. I think people have a good understanding of what other people's roles are and the impact their actions could have on them and vice versa. So I think that helps build that sort of better understanding. I think they're agile. And I think, I would slightly, I understand the point Rob was making about the impact and particularly on sort of sole traders and things. But overall, I've been highly impressed by the resilience that we've seen about small and micro businesses responding to the pandemic and the various lockdowns and the impact of that. I think it's been heartening to see. Obviously, there's been huge impact on a lot of small businesses, and for reasons completely outside their control. What they have is just not in demand at the moment. Other people have done some amazing things. Restaurants starting home delivery services. I think that's been good. And also delivery services to people who are housebound and had various problems. I think that's been good. People starting up businesses. I'll leave the PPE issue aside from here, I think, but other areas where people have moved very swiftly, come up with new services, new products. But I think what small businesses can do is they can look for opportunities. It's understanding. We were having a discussion with, the other day I was having a discussion with someone who worked for Google, and an interesting phrase struck me, which was fail fast. And I think that's something that you can actually bring in to what you're doing. It's, well, I'm not quite sure how we would phrase it, but understand when things are moving against you and respond quickly. Don't be like King Canute, sat there trying to hold the tide back, except that's happening at the moment. I've got to go with that blow, that punch, and deal with it, but come back in a different way. And I think we've seen some good work on that front. I think as well, one of the things that smaller businesses tend to have is they tend to have really good, strong relationships. Even if they're dealing into large companies, they tend to have some good personal relationships there, that people they can phone up and get more context around the corporate answer. And I think that's very important for them. And out of that, you can find out, what do those big organizations need that they're not getting? What are they scrabbling around looking for at the moment? Can I do that? Can some of my contacts, my subcontractors, do they have a skill set that's in demand at the moment? And you can respond in that way. So that agile, nimble response, I think, is a definite benefit that small businesses have.
Absolutely, and I particularly like the creativity and the fact that the strong relationships and building on those relationships. Rob.
I mean, I completely agree with Mike. It's definitely the speed of response. It's the agility, the creativity, you know, and I wasn't being negative about SMEs or small businesses. It's just, you know, the reality is I think they were taken completely by surprise. But anyway, moving on. If there's one thing that I think we need to be mindful of as SMEs right now during the pandemic, is whatever we do now will have impacts post-pandemic. And one of the things that SMEs have done brilliantly is they've adapted, they've been very creative, innovative in the way that they've created new products, but they've also reduced a lot of their prices. They've also limited their offer and boiled it down so it's attractive and it's online. And some have even certificated some of these products. And this may just come back to haunt people post the pandemic, asking the question of, during the pandemic, this was good enough. What's the issue now? It cost me half the amount. It's still allegedly the same product because you've still got your rubber stamp on this. And I think we just need to be mindful as SMEs with an eye on the future. Whatever we do now will have some kind of impact going forward. So that could be a potential weakness for some who are trying to survive, and I totally understand that, but not a race to the bottom to survive at all costs, because there is a reputational impact here at the end of this, which will be, you know, was it just clever marketing, or did you genuinely believe in the product that you were selling? And reputation is key, as we know, to all small businesses. So over to Lyndon, I think.
It is indeed, Lyndon.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I agree with all of those points. I mean, to me, the very important one is innovation. I think that SMEs, particularly those that are very entrepreneurial, I mean, I don't think we should mix entrepreneur and SMEs. Not necessarily all SME businesses are particularly entrepreneurial, but in principle, they are able to be more flexible, and they can usually come up with innovative solutions, as we've found out. But what I came home to me quite a few years ago, in fact, was talking to a delivery manager for an SME business, and talking about the principles of continuity, crisis, all the things we're talking about today. And he said, yeah, he said, but I think we're quite strong at it. He said, because, and this was tongue in cheek, but I think there was some truth in it. He said, because we actually use crisis management techniques every time we do a customer installation. And essentially what he was saying is, if it can go wrong, it will. So we are actually used to dealing with things that go wrong. We're used to thinking on our feet. We're used to being flexible. We're used to coming up with innovative approaches to it. And we have to do that every day. So I think the advantage is that fundamentally one of the advantages that SMEs have in this field is that it's actually part of life to them. Changing direction quickly, making adjustments, being innovative. These are facts of life. They are not facts of life for a departmental manager in a very, very large multinational organization. They take months, years to get any changes, and that ability to innovate, make changes quickly, cannot be trained very well. It's because it's part of your business. It's because it's part of the way that you work, and it probably, frankly, and without getting too much into people's motivation, it's probably why certain people prefer to work in those sort of businesses rather than large corporates, because they're the sort of people who want to be able to operate like that. So I think the intrinsic personality of a lot of people in SMEs make it easier to respond quickly and more imaginatively to problems.
That's all really interesting, especially given in the light of our next question, which is homing in on leadership and human factors. And I wonder if we could talk briefly about what leadership skills do those running SMEs and micro businesses need to draw upon in the face of systemic and repeated shocks. And perhaps we can also touch upon mental health and well-being in this context, and any advice you've got to offer in this area. Rob, this is definitely one for you to start off on.
God, how long have we got, Emily?
Yeah, not long.
I mean, a lot's been talked about leadership, and a lot of focus is on leadership. Personally, I'm a big favourite of surrounding yourself with the best talent, even if you're a small business. You know, even if it's external people who are not actually part of your business but can support you, and it's that. Having that diversity of approach. What we tend to do as leaders is surround ourselves with people who like what we say, agree with what we say, and that makes for a happy ship. Actually, in the current climate, we really need people who are actively saying, are we sure we want to do that? And possibly even surrounding yourself with people who are so-called rebel members of staff who are a little bit out there, a little bit left field, because you are going to need creative, adaptable people. Some people don't do change, and we're changing daily at the moment, if not hourly in some cases. You know, are we going to be open? Aren't we going to be open? Is the government going to lift restrictions? And if you've got people who are pretty rigid, including the leadership, I might add, that's going to be a recipe for disaster. So I think for a leader, self-awareness, am I flexible? Am I adaptable? And if I'm not, then let's get some help in to make us a little bit more flexible and adaptable, and possibly even a sounding board, you know, because we've all got biases, we've all got our own idiosyncrasies. So, you know, sometimes it's good for people to tell you the truth. And for that, you need the psychological safety of the organization to say, are you completely bonkers? You know, that is just not going to work. That's not going to happen. We can't do that, boss. We need to do something differently. But, you know, this is all dominance dynamics and cognitive diversity, which, again, we haven't got a huge amount of time for. But I'll hand over to one of the other guys.
Yeah, and it's actually very true, isn't it? You do need someone to question you, because actually it makes you question yourself and analyze your response and your thinking in greater detail. And if you still believe it's right, then you have to have the confidence to go forward with that. But it's that justification process. Lyndon.
Yeah, mate. The word really that springs to mind for me in answering this question is trust. Management has to trust its colleagues. It has to trust its colleagues all the time, but it has to do it even more in a crisis situation. This is sometimes a problem, though, with entrepreneurial management. Entrepreneurial management sometimes is so driven by its own vision and belief that it actually will want to surround itself with people who share that vision and belief, and not with people that can actually challenge some of those views. Now, that works very well. It quite often works well until something goes wrong. When something goes wrong, you need to be able to have colleagues you can trust their opinions, even if you don't agree with them. And that's exactly, I think the previous point was perfect on that. Even if you don't agree with them, you have to take their opinions. And if they're the experts, you have to be prepared to trust them and go with it. So why employ an IT manager? Why employ an HR manager? Why have experts in particular technical disciplines in your company? Why have financial experts if all the time you're going to second guess them and say, no, I think you're wrong, this is what we'll do? And that is the big problem in some small companies and some entrepreneurial companies. That happens in normal business. You have these supposedly heads of departments, but the top man or top lady is very strong personality, very driven, and overrides it. If you do that in a crisis situation, you're likely to end up in a big problem. So to me, I say the leader needs to concentrate purely on the big picture and leave the people with the expertise and the skill to understand what you want to accomplish through the big picture, not only in normal business, but also very much in the crisis situation. And I'd like to finish this a little bit for me, is saying, adrenaline's great. It's a great way of running the business. If you keep your adrenaline levels up all the time, you can, amazing what you can achieve. But if you try doing that in a crisis, you'll very quickly burn out. And if you burn out and you haven't trusted the other people, who's going to pick it up and make it happen? So to me, trust and leadership is about bringing people together, not telling them what to do.
And being aware of burning out, which and fatigue can lead to poor decision making and so forth. So you do need to have that trust where people will point out to you that actually your decisions aren't great. Mike, do you have any thoughts on this? We can't hear
you. Yeah, leadership versus management. I mean, there's a great debate that we could still be going on this time tomorrow on, I think. I think great leaders do need a management capability. Good managers aren't always good leaders, in fact, often aren't. So I think this is where you're looking at the value of the team. And I think the point Lyndon made about entrepreneurs driving on, but they do need people to hold them back, a bit of check and balance. So I think for people in leadership roles within SMEs, they need to engage. You've got to you don't just lead by charging off. You lead by ensuring that people have had input, agree with your decision, and have faith in the way that you're trying to take them. So I think it's important that people, particularly in smaller teams, feel that their voice is heard and valued, and doesn't necessarily have to be followed all the time, but it's getting those balances in. If somebody puts their hand up and says, I think you're wrong, you have to give them the privilege of being listened to and taken on board. If you don't agree with him, you can say, well, I understand your point, but I don't agree with you. I think the other key things about leadership are understand that if you're the leader, you're also quite critical to this process. So you've got to look out for yourself. You've got to take time for yourself. You've got to breathe. I've put down here a couple of points. Walk the dogs if you have them. If you haven't, borrow them from someone else. They're amazingly relaxing. Most evenings I get home, even if it's quite late, I take the dogs out because that's my time. Luckily, they enjoy it as well. But actually, I'm sure sometimes we go out and they're probably thinking, oh, we were wrapped up quite nicely here. But I view that as my time. And I think you've got to give that my time to other people on the team as well. You've got to understand as well that people will have reactions, not only to what's going on in the business, but what's going on into their personal lives. Have they had somebody that's been impacted by COVID? Have they not seen their elderly parents for 9 months now because of restrictions on visiting care homes? Understand that. Allow people to vent. If somebody comes in the morning having a whinge, just say, okay, let's grab a coffee and chat to people. It's a safety release valve. And I think people will give a lot more back to the company. Sorry, Lyndon.
I think he's gone to walk his dogs. No,
voted with his feet.
Oh, you're back. No, those are really, really good points, especially about listening to people. You're not suggesting dog napping as stress relief. I would emphasize, but it's yes, but then, you know, leading or managing a small business, you do have that benefit of you do know everyone a lot more closely as well, don't you? You do have those links and relationships, and hopefully there is mutual trust and faith. I'm going to ask.
Can I just add a point, Emily? Sorry. One thing that is a bit of a myth is that the leader has to be the leader throughout all the phases of the crisis. And I think this is the other thing that people need to understand is, you know, people have skills, people have behaviors that fit nicely with different parts of the crisis, whether it's preparedness, response, recovery, you know, whatever phases you're going through. And you know, the leader does not have to be the leader throughout all of those. You know, and going back to the well-being and resilience, it's probably best that they're not. And bringing the right personality, the right skill sets in to deliver that phase of the crisis is pretty crucial. And for the leader, that goes back to that self-awareness bit is, am I the best person to lead on this element? And if you're not, then at least have the kind of the courage to say that actually I think there's other people in the mix who could lead this better.
That's a very good point. Thank you. We're going to move on to a question from the audience, which I think is great. Now, we've only got 10 minutes left, and there's one more question I want to talk about the future after this. But what are the downsides of investing in preparedness activities? Lyndon, you go first.
Well, it's very difficult for me to think of any. The only thing that anything that has been thrown around, of course, over the years is, well, it's very expensive, all this preparation and planning and providing, necessary capability to deal with situations for things that will never happen. And I've always got a simple answer to that and say, well, it's a lot more expensive not to have provided for it if it does happen. But so I don't really, I'd be interested to see what my colleagues have to say, but to me, I don't see any real downside in good preparation. What I do see a downside in is wasting money on preparation. And a lot of organizations, in my view, and it is a personal view, obviously, have wasted a lot of money on things that are not necessary, inappropriate, and not really focusing on the key issues. So what I say, to people on this, whatever you do should have benefits to your day-to-day running. If it's only going to work when you have this arbitrary crisis that you don't know what it's going to be and you've defined it as an all hazards risk, which is fine, and I would go along with that as an approach. But essentially, what you do should improve your business. It shouldn't just be there for a crisis. And we've found this, haven't we? I mean, people talk a lot about how good it's been that people have been able to work from home. Well, actually, the reason it's been successful is that it's been rolled out from something that already existed. So many years ago, when disaster recovery was probably the reason why people had work from home as part of their strategy rather than the other reason, then it gradually got rolled out so that people did it as part of their normal working, but not everybody and not all the time. So when it was needed in this emergency situation, it was possible to roll it out. It wouldn't have been possible to roll it out, in my opinion, if it didn't exist at all, because a crisis is no time to learn. So to me, you need to get benefits in your normal organization out of what you spend your money on, but there isn't really a downside if you do it properly.
Good point. Rob, very quickly, because then we'll move on to the last question.
Yeah, I think I just echo what Lyndon said. I think it's about preparing for reality, not the myths, spending the money in the right place. I mean, you know, around the world, we spend oodles of money on counterterrorism, which is great, but then we flood every year, or we have other types of disasters. And, you know, we don't always have to listen to what the media is telling us is what the threats are. You know, we need to work that out for our own businesses, really.
Good point. Mike?
I would say, yeah, the danger is spending money you don't need to and spending time that you can ill afford to on it. You've got to make sure you don't get dragged away from your main core activity and keep it proportional. I think Lyndon touched on a good point, which is part of the process that you go through, you will identify those single points of failure, the key areas where you can be impacted. So you change those as you go along. And that's the point. Learn from that planning process and adapt it so you don't actually have the vulnerability anymore. But yeah, I'll leave it there because you want to move on.
Yes, because we have 4 minutes. Turning to the future, what do you think's on the horizon that should be planned for? And do you have any other comments on the future, or something that, what have we learned from this particular pandemic on how we prepare for future events? Rob, would you like to start with that one, please?
Yeah, very simple. Focus on you and your people. For all the processes, procedures, and everything else in the world, your people will make and break that crisis for you. If they are the right people in the right place at the right time with the right skill sets, half the job is already done. Good
point. Mike?
I would say coming into next year, I think we need to be aware as SMEs that a lot of larger companies are going to be quite vulnerable and may well not survive. As the furlough schemes fall away, markets may not be there, they may have changed quite drastically. So limit your exposure as SMEs to your larger clients. It may sound great, but don't run up tens of thousands of invoices sitting out there with them, or even more. We got caught out by a large company failing with little or no notice about 2 years ago. And I think as an SME, don't forget that you can ask for better payment terms from large companies. Their corporate social responsibility programs will tend to have that. They may not publicize it to you, but 90 days doesn't have to be standard. Go in and say, no, we can't deal with you on that basis. We're not here to be your bank. We're here to supply you a service or goods. Oh, one other good point. I hope it's a good point. Look at your insurance cover going forward. Insurance is going to change. Make sure that you understand what your insurer is actually offering and how it covers your needs.
That's a great point. And especially about the terms and the payments and so on. Yes, small businesses are not cash flow providers for larger businesses, and that's the way that a lot of business seem to have gone for a long time, and it's just not right or equitable, is it? Lyndon, last thoughts from you, please.
Last thoughts then, really, is to echo what has been said, which is absolutely right. I always used to say to clients many years ago, when having plans was perhaps more a novelty, I used to say, well, having plans is great, but plans don't manage your recovery. You and your people manage your recovery. And that is true today as it ever was. The one thing I would say, however, for the future is be careful what you plan for. Plan for what's appropriate to you, what is sensible to you, what is more realistic. Try and plan for all hazards, in the sense that your plan is to work out what we would do in the event of not being able to do something. So the response is a bit more about interruption rather than actually what happened. But bear in mind that certain things are going to have much more dramatic effects on you than others. We're unlikely to have major volcanic or earthquake action in the UK, but on some of the areas in the world I work, then that's the only thing they're going to be worried about. So it's as simple as that, really. Be sensible, and don't just prepare for pandemics, because I can see this happening. I can see everyone who didn't prepare for the pandemic now spending a lot of time and money with consultants and advisors on building for the next pandemic plan. I'm not saying a pandemic won't happen again.
Very, very good point. Well,
it may happen, but don't just plan for that.
We're completely out of time now, so I just thank you all. Thank you, Lyndon, Rob, and Mike. And thank you to everyone who's attended. I hope you found it useful. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.